Part 1. There's a number I want you to sit with for a second. $3,000 a month. That's not from cattle. That's not from a market garden that takes over your entire summer. That's not from some complicated value-added product you have to learn food safety law to sell. That number is coming from an animal most homesteaders walk right past on their way to build a chicken coop. Meat rabbits. And I'm not talking about raising a few for your own freezer. I'm talking about a real, structured business that stacks 4 or 5 income streams on top of the same handful of hutches until the math actually adds up to $3,000 a month, sometimes more. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly how that number gets built, piece by piece, and the system that gets you there without needing acreage, a tractor, or a 5-figure startup budget. Stick with me all the way through, because I'm going to break down the real numbers most people never show you. Here's why almost nobody is doing this. Everyone who wants a homestead income defaults to the same handful of animals, and every single one of them has the same problem. The startup cost eats you alive before you ever see a dollar back. Goats need real fencing and real pasture. A small flock of laying hens sounds simple, until you do the math on feed versus egg prices and realize you're basically breaking even most months. Meat birds are fast, but the margin between what you spend on feed and what you'd pay at the store is thinner than people think, especially with feed prices where they've been. And a lot of people just assume rabbits are a kid's pet project, a cage in the corner of the yard, not a real business. That assumption is exactly why the opportunity is still sitting there, wide open, for anyone willing to actually run the numbers. Because here's the thing nobody talks about. Rabbits aren't just cheap to raise. They're one of the only homestead animals where you can realistically layer 4 or 5 separate revenue streams on top of the same breeding stock, in the same small footprint, without adding a single extra hutch. That's the entire secret behind the $3,000 number. It's never one product. It's meat, breeding stock, manure, pelts, and specialty markets, all running off the same rabbits at the same time. Let's break down exactly how each piece stacks. Item 1. Meat sales that actually move. A single healthy doe can produce well over 100 pounds of meat in a year, and a small operation running 4 to 6 productive does can be turning out well over 400 pounds of dressed rabbit annually without much strain on space or labor. Rabbit meat sells direct to buyers, not through a grocery store markup, at anywhere from $6 to $10 a pound, depending on your region and whether you're selling whole, cut, or processed further. Restaurants chasing a farm-to-table angle, specialty butchers, and health-conscious families looking for lean, hormone-free protein are all buyers who will pay a real premium for rabbit meat they can't get consistently anywhere else. A modest operation moving even 200 pounds a month at $7 a pound is already sitting at $1,400 before a single other revenue stream even gets added in. Your first step here is simple. Don't try to sell meat retail out of a cooler at a farmer's market and hope for foot traffic. Walk into 2 or 3 local restaurants that already lean into local sourcing. Bring a sample and ask if they have a reliable local rabbit supplier. Almost none of them do, and that one conversation is worth more than a season of market tables. Item 2. Breeding stock sales, which is where the real leverage in this business lives. Selling a butchered rabbit pays you once. Selling a proven breeding pair pays you at a completely different scale, because you're not selling meat, you're selling someone else's entire future income stream in a single transaction. A quality buck or doe from documented healthy meat breed lines, New Zealand, Californian, or a solid cross of the two, regularly sells for $40 to $75 a rabbit to other homesteaders and small breeders just getting started. And here's the part that makes this stream so much more efficient than meat sales. You're not raising these animals any differently than the rabbits headed to the freezer. Same feed, same hutch, same daily routine. The only difference is which animals you decide to sell live instead of processing. A single strong litter can produce 2 or 3 animals worth selling as breeding stock at 3 to 5 times what that same animal would earn as meat, with 0 additional cost to you. Your step here is to keep simple, clean breeding records from day one. Dates, litter sizes, weights, because that paperwork is the difference between an ordinary rabbit and a documented, provable breeding line that buyers will pay a premium for without blinking. Item 3. manure, which almost every new rabbit keeper throws away without ever thinking twice about it. Rabbit manure is one of the only manures you can apply directly to a garden bed without composting first, since it won't burn tender roots the way hot manures like chicken or fresh cattle manure will. That alone makes it valuable to home gardeners who don't want to deal with a months-long composting process just to fertilize a raised bed. Bagged rabbit manure moves at markets and through local gardening groups and online listings at anywhere from $6 to $12 a bag, and a modest Rabbitry easily produces enough manure in a month to fill a dozen or more bags with essentially zero additional input cost, since the animals are producing it regardless of whether you collect and sell it or let it go to waste. Your step here is to set a simple collection tray or bin under each hutch so nothing gets lost, and split what you collect between your own garden beds and bagged product for sale. It costs you a bin and a few minutes a week, and it turns what most people consider a cleanup chore into a standing line item on your monthly income. Item 4. Pelts. The stream almost nobody bothers with because it requires one extra skill most homesteaders haven't picked up yet: basic tanning. Every rabbit processed for meat leaves behind a hide that, properly tanned, sells to crafters, makers, and hobbyists who use rabbit fur for everything from small leather goods to fly-tying material for fishermen. A well-tanned rabbit pelt can sell for $8 to $20, depending on the size, color, and quality of the tan, and unlike meat or breeding stock, this is pure additional revenue from an animal you were already processing anyway. The hide would otherwise be discarded entirely. Learning basic home tanning takes some practice, and a modest upfront investment in tanning solution and tools. But once you've got the process down, it turns a byproduct that used to cost you nothing, but also earned you nothing, into a genuine fourth income stream, running alongside meat, breeding stock, and manure. Stack all four of those together, even at modest, conservative volume, meat sales in the low hundreds of dollars, a couple of breeding pairs sold each month, a dozen bags of manure, and a handful of tanned pelts, and you start to see exactly how this business clears $3,000 a month without ever needing more than a handful of hutches and a small, well-managed breeding program. And that's before we even get into the fifth stream, the one almost no one thinks to try, and the exact system for scaling a single trio into that kind of month-over-month income without drowning yourself in more rabbits than you can manage. That's exactly where we're headed next. We left off with 4 income streams already stacked: meat, breeding stock, manure, and pelts. And even at conservative numbers, that combination gets you well on the way toward $3,000 a month. But there's a fifth stream almost nobody talks about, and it's often the one with the highest margin of all, because it requires almost no additional labor beyond what you're already doing. And once all 5 streams are running together, off the same handful of hutches, that's when the real number starts to come into focus. Item 5. Specialty and niche markets that most rabbit keepers never think to pursue. Beyond restaurant sales and general meat customers, there's a whole tier of buyers most homesteaders never approach, including pet food companies and raw feeders sourcing rabbit for dogs and cats on species-appropriate diets, reptile owners who need whole prey rabbit for larger snakes and monitors, and specialty grocers stocking rabbit for ethnic cuisines where it's a traditional staple ingredient that's difficult to source consistently at the local level. These buyers often pay differently than a standard restaurant order, sometimes taking smaller cuts, off-weight animals, or whole rabbits at prices that beat generic wholesale rates, simply because their supply is even harder to come by than a restaurant's. A single relationship with a raw pet food supplier or a reptile specialty store can absorb culls, smaller animals, or offcuts that wouldn't otherwise sell well at premium restaurant pricing, meaning almost nothing from your operation ever goes to waste. Your step here is the same one that works for every other stream on this list. Walk in, bring a sample, and ask the one question that opens the door. Do you have a reliable local supplier for this? In most areas, the honest answer is no, and that single conversation can turn into a standing monthly order within a matter of weeks. Now let's talk about how this actually scales without turning into more work than it's worth, because this is where most people either make real money or burn out and quit within a year. The engine behind everything on this list is a small, well-managed breeding program, and the entire system starts with exactly what it started with in traditional homesteading: one buck and 2 or 3 does. From that single trio, disciplined breeding on a staggered schedule, staggering litters so you're never processing, selling, and collecting manure all at once, but instead have a steady rolling output every few weeks, turns 3 rabbits into a genuine monthly production line within about 6 months. Each doe can realistically produce 4 to 6 litters a year, and once you're running 4 to 6 productive does on a staggered schedule, you have a continuous stream of animals reaching meat weight, breeding age, and pelt-ready stages every single week of the year. That's exactly what lets you serve restaurant standing orders, breeding stock buyers, and manure customers all at the same time, without ever having a dead month where nothing is ready to sell. The mistake almost every beginner makes right here is trying to scale all 5 streams on day 1. Don't. Start with meat and manure in your first few months, since those two require the least additional skill and infrastructure to get right. Once your does are proven and producing reliably, layer in breeding stock sales, since that requires you to have actual confidence in your genetics and records before you can charge a real premium for them. Add pelts once you've got basic tanning technique down, since that's a skill that benefits from a slow learning curve rather than rushing it under commercial pressure, while you're also trying to manage everything else. And bring in specialty market relationships last, once your production volume is consistent enough that you can actually promise a buyer reliable weekly or monthly supply, since nothing kills a wholesale relationship faster than promising volume you can't deliver on schedule. There's a second mistake that sinks people just as often, and it's underpricing out of fear. New sellers, especially with breeding stock, tend to price low because they're nervous nobody will pay a real number for an animal they assume they could technically buy cheaper somewhere else. But buyers looking for documented, healthy meat breed genetics aren't comparison shopping against the cheapest rabbit at a local swap meet. They're paying for proven lines that save them years of guesswork and failed litters of their own, and pricing yourself at a real premium, $40 to $75 for a documented breeding animal, is not just acceptable, it's expected once you have the records to back it up. Underselling breeding stock doesn't just cost you money on that one sale. It trains your entire customer base to expect bargain pricing going forward, which is a much harder habit to break later than it is to avoid in the first place. A third mistake worth flagging here is neglecting the winter production schedule, because this is exactly where the $3,000 number either holds steady or quietly collapses. Rabbits breed and raise litters through the cold, without much fuss, needing little more than a dry, draft-free hutch, and water that isn't allowed to freeze solid. Homesteaders who let their production slow down over winter, because it feels like the natural seasonal lull, end up losing exactly the months when restaurant demand for local protein often holds steady, or even increases, and when breeding stock buyers, planning their own spring operations months in advance, are actively shopping for animals to start their season. Keeping your does on a consistent breeding schedule straight through winter, with nothing more than a draft-free hutch and unfrozen water standing between you and full production, is often the single biggest factor separating an operation that clears $3,000 a month year-round from one that only hits that number for half the year and quietly struggles through the other 6. A fourth thing worth being honest about is record keeping, because it touches every single stream on this list at once. Without a simple notebook tracking breeding dates, litter sizes, weaning weights, and, which does consistently throw the strongest litters, you're not running a business. You're guessing, and guessing is expensive when you're trying to price breeding stock at a premium or promise a restaurant consistent weekly volume. 10 minutes a week with a notebook is the difference between an operation that scales cleanly and one that stalls out because nobody, including you, can say with confidence which animals are actually worth keeping in your breeding program. Picture what this actually looks like once it's running the way it's meant to. A standing weekly order with 1 or 2 local restaurants covering your baseline meat income. A breeding pair or 2 sold most months to new homesteaders, finding you through word of mouth or a simple online listing. A steady handful of manure bags moving through a local gardening group, with 0 additional cost to produce, since the animals create it regardless of whether you collect it. A slow but growing side income from tanned pelts, sold to crafters who've become repeat customers, once they know your quality is consistent. And a specialty buyer or two, whether that's a raw pet food supplier or a reptile shop, absorbing whatever doesn't fit neatly into those other categories, so nothing from the operation ever goes to waste. None of these streams individually needs to be enormous. Stacked together, running off the same handful of hutches and the same modest, disciplined breeding program, they add up to real, dependable monthly income that most homesteaders assume requires acreage, expensive livestock, and equipment they'll never be able to afford. So here's the question worth asking yourself. Out of these 5 streams, meat, breeding stock, manure, pelts, and specialty markets, which one would you actually start with on your own place? Drop it in the comments. I read every one, and rabbits might just change your mind about what a small homestead income can really look like. If this opened your eyes to what's sitting in a hutch the size of a coffee table, hit subscribe and ring the bell, because this channel is where self-reliant folks learn the income streams the big food system hopes you never think to try.